very much. Since the topic of this session is changing times, I thought I would concentrate on one particular aspect of the changing times, which otherwise would not get the attention that it deserves. Let me begin by making a statement, very clear, namely that I believe that the neoliberal phase of capitalism has come to a dead end. Now, I say this not because I particularly like speaking in hyperboles, but that's genuinely what I believe. By the neoliberal phase of capitalism, what I have in mind is the fact that within capitalism, never in its history did you have the degree of lack of restraint upon flows of commodities and capital, including finance, across national borders, not just juridical restraints, but even when it was juridically free, it was not actually moving around freely to the same extent as it has done in the current period, which we call neoliberalism. Even if we contrast this with the post-war years of what I would call dirigism or Keynesian demand management and so on, which was the period of the 50s and 60s, which many people refer to as the golden age of capitalism, there's a remarkable contrast between that period when there were serious restraints on capital and commodity flows and the current period when a lot of these restraints have actually disappeared. Now, why is it the case that I believe this phase has come to an end? If you look at the period of neoliberal capitalism, basically the earlier period, let's contrast it with the earlier period, the golden age, the so-called golden age of capitalism, the period in which capitalism witnessed very rapid rates of growth was one that was characterized by substantial state intervention, be it third world countries where you had narrow-in planning, or first world countries where you had Keynesian-style demand management. Now, that was a phase, in other words, when the state was very active. Now, the fact of globalization of finance put an end to that phase because the state that was so active in intervening was a nation state. Globalization, or the free mobility of capital, made capital into a global entity. So you had this contrast in which you had global capital confronting nation states. Now, insofar as the nations, global capital doesn't like state intervention except through promoting the incentives or providing inducements to capitalists, including to finance. It doesn't like direct state intervention in matters of generating employment, stimulating demand, generating larger output growth rate, and so on. This opposition has always been there. It is still there today, which is why you have fiscal responsibility legislation and such like. But the point is that that was a phase which had to come to an end because the dictates of finance against state intervention, intervention by the nation state, became decisive. In other words, this dislike of finance against state intervention took a decisive turn because finance was global and state intervention was by a nation state. If a nation state went against the dictates of finance, finance would just leave that particular country, go somewhere else, and create a massive financial crisis there. Because of this, state intervention more or less came to an end. Therefore, in the neoliberal period, the stimulus for growth, the stimulus for a boom, would arise only from the formation of bubbles. In the United States in particular, the largest capitalist economy, the formation of the dot-com bubble was responsible for the huge boom of the 90s, and the formation of the housing bubble was responsible for the huge boom in the earlier part of the current century. Now, the collapse of these booms, the collapse of the first boom was one which was followed by the second, but the collapse of the second has not been followed by any other bubble. And of course, bubbles can't be made to order. You can't hold a gun to somebody's head and say speculate and bring about an asset price bubble. The monetary policy in the United States to stimulate this bubble was so remarkable that it actually brought down interest rates to zero. Even so, there was no particularly noticeable bubble, which is why the US economy and the world economy in general continues to be mired in a crisis. Now, this therefore implies that now, in the foreseeable future, there is no way for the world capitalist economy to revive from this period of crisis, and because in the advanced countries, during the entire period, even these bubbles, during this entire period, you found that real wages were not rising because there were American workers were now competing in the period of globalization with Chinese, Vietnamese, Indonesian, Bangladeshi, Indian workers. Therefore, their wages were not rising. And in the period of the collapse of the bubble, not only have wages not been rising, but in fact there has been a larger general level of unemployment. Therefore, the working classes in the advanced countries have had an extremely difficult time in this period of particularly the collapse of the bubble. For instance, if you look at the real wage rate in the United States of male workers, the real wage rate in 2011, and you compare it with the real wage rate of an average male American worker in 1968, you find that the 2011 level is marginally lower. Now, if this happens in the United States, you can imagine what the situation generally is in the capitalist world. Now, because of this, there has been an enormous groundswell of protest. Liberal bourgeois established parties have not even taken cognizance of this groundswell of protest and have in fact not even recognized it as a crisis. Hillary Clinton hardly talked about the crisis during the presidential election. It is the Trumps, it is the, it is the Brexiters, it is the Trumps and so on who have actually cognized the crisis. What they recommend as a solution, they're not even going to follow and so on, but that's a separate issue. But one of the reasons for their acquiring a certain degree of popularity and legitimacy and in many cases coming to power is because they have recognized this crisis. The fact that the neoliberal capitalist era is at an end is clear even from Trump's own actions. What Trump is doing is trying to set up a patchwork whereby mobility of capital, particularly mobility of finance, continues, but on the other hand, there's protectionism of the US economy, where mobility of commodities produced by American capital itself in countries like China or Vietnam is no longer allowed to enter freely into the US economy, and American capital that thereby suffers a loss on this account is then compensated through massive tax cuts. So Trump's strategy is to combine protection against commodity flows with freedom of financial flows. Now that's a way of trying to save neoliberal capitalism or what remains of it. But on the other hand, it's clear that at any rate, neoliberal capitalism, as we have known it till now, is at an end. Now the kind of thing that Trump is doing, and he's also trying to enlarge military expenditure through a larger fiscal deficit in order to generate some demand, greater employment and so on. The kind of thing that Trump is trying to do is something which is non-replicable elsewhere. It is remarkable that the three things that Trump is doing, on the one hand, freedom of financial flows, on the other hand, protection against imports of commodities, and thirdly, an enlarged fiscal deficit. If any other country tried doing that, it would have a massive financial crisis, because finance would flow out of that country. Even European countries would not dare to do that. But the US has been able to do it because for much of the world, the US dollar is still considered as good as gold, the most stable form in which wealth can be held, and consequently, as a matter of fact, in a period in which there is uncertainty, you find that much of the world's money flows into the United States. It's quite interesting that in 2008, for instance, when there was the collapse of the housing bubble, there was a crisis happening in the US, but from all over the world, finance started getting drawn to the US. You would have thought that from a crisis-ridden economy, finance would be flowing out, but just the opposite was happening because of the specific role of the dollar. But because these things cannot be replicated elsewhere, you find that countries like India, or a whole range of countries, let's say, which are the so-called newly emerging countries, China accepted, are really going to face a very serious problem. They are not only going to face the problem of facing the problem of the crisis, but they're also facing the problem arising from Trump's attempt to act in the context of this crisis. So they are victims of both, and of course they cannot do what Trump himself is doing, namely to remain within some kind of a neoliberal framework with regard to financial flows, but of course introduce protection. Because of this, I think what they need to do in such a situation, they want to get out of the crisis, is actually have controls both on commodity flows as well as on financial flows. But doing that means basically opting out of the neoliberal framework, but that opting out is something which would require a kind of political support, which would require, in other words, the support of classes other than, let's say, the very big business in India, which is still committed to this kind of neoliberalism. It has no other agenda at the moment, and if you wish to have an alternative economic strategy, you would have to base it on an alternative class alliance, which therefore would require an agenda which is altogether different from the neoliberal agenda. You can't get peasant support unless you actually give something to the peasantry. As a result, I think many of the countries like India or Indonesia and so on are not only hit by a very serious crisis, but in fact they cannot get out of the crisis without doing something which is very substantial, which would require a kind of political change. You just look at all these countries. Turkey is in the midst of a huge crisis. India, Indonesia, South Africa, all of them, the so-called middle-level countries, all of them are hit by a massive crisis at the moment, and there is no easy way to get out of it, except, as I said, by an alternative agenda based on an alternative class alliance. Now, the current government, of course, is doing nothing. Now, there can be the argument they are putting forward is that if you do nothing, ultimately the rupee would stabilize at a certain value. It's all right, it's falling at the moment, but it will stabilize at a certain value, and then from there on, once more, there will be a revival of our growth and so on. Now, I think that's a completely mistaken position for the simple reason that at the moment, for instance, oil prices are rising, the rupee is collapsing against the dollar, because of which the import costs of oil are going to go up in rupee terms for both these reasons. That tends to get passed on. Inflation begins to get accelerated, and when inflation accelerates, then all speculators believe that the rupee is going to depreciate further, and therefore there's more money taken out of the rupee from $2, and that in turn gives rise to greater depreciation. So the whole idea that if you do nothing, there's a thing called equilibrium that at which the market would settle is a completely wrong idea, because if you do nothing, then speculators can actually drive the rupee to abysmal depths. When it gets driven towards abysmal depths, then of course the country would have to stabilize the rupee, unless it goes in, as I said, for a set of measures which protect the country against the free flow of commodities and finance, would have to go to the IMF. In which case, IMF or to the international financial market, in which case India would get caught in the same kind of position as Greece, for instance, or a good deal of Southern Europe has been. Therefore, it seems to me that at the moment there are two possible paths, and the path of getting caught in the Greece-type situation is one that would impose, needless to say, enormous hardships on people who are on the verge, vast masses of people on the verge of subsistence. And this is something which, however, can go on and on and on, like in the case of Greece, it has been going on and on. The alternative, if you want to forestall that, is of course to have an alternative economic agenda, but that alternative economic agenda would then require a kind of political constituency for it. Let's not forget that in the midst of the Great Depression of the 1930s, Latin American countries that actually protected themselves from the crisis and brought about import substituting industrialization, every one of them had really a political upheaval before they could carry out these economic policies. But what kind of political upheaval would be required to bring about this alternative class alliance and so on, we can discuss, but it's very important for us at least to be aware of the fact that changing times have brought us to a kind of crossroads where we cannot go on the way we have been doing.